Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the March Elders Climate Action National Call. We have an exciting presentation for you tonight, and I'd like to welcome you. I hope you're all experiencing, for those of you who've been in the throes of winter, I hope you're all experiencing a little warmth for spring. And we're going to get started. We have a lot to cover tonight. Just before we introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that we have, if you hover across the bottom of your screen, you will see some boxes. If you have questions, if you hit the Q&A box and ask your question in there, we'll be able to pass that question on to Janet McCabe at the end of her presentation. If you have any information that you want to share with people or websites or anything, you can communicate that in the chat box. Before we get started, I'm hoping everybody is settled, and I welcome you. I'd like to introduce Steve Simon, who is the chair of our policy committee and on our national coordinating council, and he's going to introduce our speaker tonight, both of whom are from Indiana. So Steve.
Yeah. Okay, it's a genuine pleasure to have Janet McCabe with us tonight. Janet and I met last fall in a little town called Wabash, Indiana, that where something called the Hoosier Environmental Council was having their annual meeting called Greening the State House, which is always a difficult job here, but we keep at it. Janet is gonna, so we started talking about the EPA because I had spent most of the 80s working with the EPA. And then she started working with them around 2009 and ended up as the assistant administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, which is a major position with the EPA nominated by President Obama. Janet right now is professor of practice at the Indiana University McKinney School of Law and assistant director for policy and implementation at IU's Environmental Resilience Institute. She is also a senior law fellow with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Of course, she was AA with the Office of Air and Radiation, so her office had a lot to do with the Clean Power Plan, and she'll discuss that somewhat tonight. And she was with the EPA since 2009, serving as the principal Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Office of Air and Radiation, and joining the EPA in 2009. Prior to that, she had many positions through her career working with an array of environmental organizations, including the, Department of Environmental Management Office, Air Quality of Indiana, and was the Assistant Attorney General for Environmental Protection in the state of Massachusetts, and Assistant Secretary for Environmental Impact Review. So Janet grew up in Washington, where I spent many years, and graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School. And her talk is really gonna light us up a little bit, the past, present, and future of environmental protection, both threats and opportunities. And Janet, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for that really nice introduction. And I always think every time somebody goes through my biography that I really need to make it shorter. But it reflects that I've had a long career doing air quality work, and air quality work now means climate change work, as we'll talk about. And it's been an amazing opportunity. I had a boss once who said, if you really want to affect public health, put something into the air or take something out of the air, because we all breathe it and we're all exposed to it. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be with you tonight. Thank you so much. And thank you to this organization for existing and to be a place where people who care about these issues can learn about things, keep up to date, be in community with one another, because it's so important that we do that. And anytime I have the opportunity to speak to a group like this, I never say no if I possibly can make it. So, let me, I'm going to share my slides with you guys. It's always a little funny to talk to when you can't see who you're talking to, but I'm just going to assume that you're all there and absolutely fascinated, and we will have a great time. So Steve mentioned the title of my presentation, which you should be able to, you should be able to see here. It's pretty lofty. And to really do this justice, we would be on the call until tomorrow morning, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to talk about mostly what's going on right now, but I want to begin and end with a little bit of history and then a little bit of the broader context at the end. So many of us remember, actually I can safely say that on this call, that places in the United States used to look like this when it came to air quality. These are the kinds of pictures we see from China and India now. But we had significant air pollution problems, visible ones, some decades ago. And these sorts of scenes, as well as some other issues in water and waste, led to a big explosion of interest in protecting our environment that resulted in, among other things, some landmark pieces of legislation. This is a picture of President Nixon signing the Clean Air Act in 1970, and or maybe this is the bill creating EPA. They were both done that year. It is an interesting historical fact that most of the major environmental laws in this country were enacted during Republican administrations. The person standing behind the president on his right, our left, I just had, as a point of Hoosier pride, I need to point out that's William Ruckelshaus, who was the first administrator of the EPA. He later went on to serve in the Justice Department during a very turbulent period of time in 1974, and came back to EPA during the Reagan administration. He is a true environmental hero, and I point him out because he is also a Hoosier. He grew up in Indianapolis. He was the head of the State Board of Health in Indiana, and then went on to do great things. And he really, many of the current EPA employees, he is the paragon. He is the hero, and we're very proud of him. Okay, so I want to just mention, people talk about how challenging climate change is, and that's absolutely correct. This is an extremely difficult challenge that we're faced with now. But I want to mention that in the past, we have encountered environmental challenges that people back then said, this is really impossible to address. And if we do it, it will break the system. It will cost too much. The lights will go out. Nobody will be able to afford electricity, or whatever the particular concern was. And yet, through ingenuity, innovation, legislation or regulations that pushed the industry in the right ways at the right time, we have actually solved or come very close to solving some hugely significant environmental issues. I love to show this slide. This is a picture of that shows blood lead levels in children over time. And what this reflects is the point in time in which lead was taken out of gasoline. And the minute that happened, there was a positive public health response, which is that children's blood lead levels went way down. So a great example of a problem solved. This is another, this chart shows how much cleaner cars are than they were back in the 80s. I think that's when that starts. You look at that chart, it's just staggering how much cleaner vehicles have gotten. Now, it's still the case that vehicles are one of the most significant sources of air pollution, including climate harming pollution in the country. We drive, hundreds of millions of miles. So we still need to worry and continue to have those lines go ever downward. But if you just, it's pretty impressive how much we have cleaned up motor vehicles in the last 40 years. The bottom picture is, if we remember, back 30 years ago or so, there was a huge concern about chemicals in the atmosphere that were creating, thinning the protective ozone layer around the Earth, particularly at the pole. What were we going to do? These chemicals were used far and wide in a lot of different applications, including foam sprays and aerosols and things like that. Everybody, the entire world, all the countries in the world came together and entered something called the Montreal Protocol that called for reduction and elimination of those harmful pollutants over time. And that has proceeded, in fact, to happen. And scientists are now saying that this problem is on its way to being solved. People thought this could not be done. Another great example is acid rain. These two maps compare the deposition of sulfates, that's from air pollution in the early 90s and a couple of years ago. Look at the difference there. And we did that through a law enacted in 1990 that said that power plants needed to reduce their sulfur emissions, and they did so, and did so in a way that did not harm the economy. I put that little critter on the bottom because he or she is very sensitive to acid levels, to pH levels in ponds and lakes in New England and such. And these little critters are more abundant now because we have affected the environment in a positive way. And the last example is visibility in our national parks and wilderness areas. Congress put into the Clean Air Act a goal that we should be able to see across the Grand Canyon, and we should be able not have these incredible vistas obscured by man-made pollution, and told EPA, you go do that. You go enact a program that will do that. And these are pictures that show the difference that's been made in terms of regional haze in national parks. And I just, again, once more have to brag on Indiana because we have the newest national park, our Lakeshore, our Dunes National Park that was named this year. So the views are clearer there too. Okay, the last sort of historical slide I want to show is this one, which was a slide I used in probably every talk I gave when I was at EPA. We called it the baby slide, although that baby is probably 40 years old now because of how long ago we started this slide. But this is the kind of slide that you want to see, right? So there are several measures of economic activity represented on this slide. Energy consumption, population, vehicle miles traveled, gross domestic product, and they have all gone up over time. Some staggeringly by a lot, but all of them significantly. And look at that line on the bottom, the light purple line on the bottom, the 6 common air pollutants that we regulate in this country that affect public health have gone down by 73% over that same time period. So what this shows to me is that you can have positive economic activity in a way that not only doesn't increase air pollution and public health effects, but in fact reduces them. And there are many, many American companies that have made a lot of money on the new chemicals they've invented, the technologies like catalytic converters and scrubbers and those sorts of technologies that we use here, but that are also used all around the world. And American companies can benefit from the business that they achieve. So this is great. The one line that is not so great on there is the 23% line that it represents CO2 emissions. And you can see that while that's been trending down in the last couple of years, it has still grown over time. And it tracks actually quite carefully the energy consumption line because energy produces CO2, and when you can see actually the little dip around 2008, 2009, that represents the time of the recession. When there was a slowdown in economic activity, that meant a slowdown in energy consumption and therefore fewer CO2 emissions. So we can do this. So let's shift to some less happy visuals. This is a pretty common slide. I'm sure you've seen, if not this one, then something like it, that tracks global temperature increases over time and puts it on top of CO2 emissions over time. And you can clearly see, starting around the turn of the last century, that those emissions really started to go up. And temperatures have gone up in remarkably similar fashion. It seems like every time we open the newspaper or turn on the news, we are hearing about a new report or new study that is confirming, emphasizing, enhancing the conclusions that scientists have been building on for years now, which is that our climate is changing. It is having significant impacts in a variety of areas, not just health, and that human-created greenhouse gas emissions are responsible for this significant climate change. So these are the most recent two big reports. One from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I guess that's why they refer to it as the IPCC, because nobody can say intergovernmental. They're associated with the UN, and they did this study that was intended to look at the difference between a global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade versus 2 degrees centigrade. And it's sort of not really funny, because it isn't funny, but if you read the report, a lot of the conclusions are we're going to have a range of significant impacts at 1.5 degrees, and we'll have even more at 2 degrees centigrade. So I think many of us on this call probably could have said that even without this big report, but we need these scientific reports to support those kinds of conclusions. The National Climate Assessment is something that the United States government puts together. There are representatives from science agencies all across the federal government that work on these together and put them out on a regular schedule. The US is actually very sophisticated at tracking greenhouse gas emissions and impacts on the country. And I and others were very pleased, I mean, not pleased with the conclusions, but pleased to see that this report, in fact, did come out on schedule at the end of 2018. I have the links on here for both of these if you want to look at them, but they confirm and affirm the conclusions and the reports that we see day after day, that we have significant changes going on here. And, you know, just to remind ourselves with some disturbing photographs, the one of the house falling into the ocean is from a coastal village in Alaska, where, I mean, talk about existential. There are villages along the coast of Alaska that the state of Alaska has declared will not survive. And the villages will have to be relocated because they are the sea level is rising, and the sea ice is not forming as early in the fall as it is used to forming. Therefore, the coastal areas are much more vulnerable to the fall storms and the erosion. And so you see that happening. I can barely stand to read about what's happening to the coral reefs because I find it so terribly sad. I put the little bird on there because we know that there are changes in climate here and elsewhere that are affecting birds' habitat and migratory patterns and breeding patterns and all that sort of thing. So lots and lots of things going on. So let me shift more away from science, which is actually not my field, to the field of policy and how policy gets made, and talk a little bit about the end of, especially the second Obama term, and then now what's happening with respect to climate change in particular. I teach at a law school, and I talk to a lot of students, either law students or public policy students, and I love to use this slide because I think a lot of people, especially young people, have never had a conversation about all the different ways that an administration can make policy changes. And so I go through these different types of approaches and talk about them with students, ranging all the way from legislation, which is pretty challenging these days, has been for a while, down to types of approaches that are pretty simple but can significantly affect the policy direction of an agency. And all of these things that are listed on here are things that this administration has used and is using to affect their policy preferences about climate change, fossil fuel energy at large, and the whole idea of regulations and regulating economic activity to achieve various public goods. So it includes a number of executive orders. I'll talk about two in particular. The president's budget. President's budgets always reflect their view of what should be emphasized and what should be de-emphasized. This president has put forward a budget each year that cuts EPA's budget by about 30% overall, with significant attention to certain parts of the agency, like the science parts and climate change. Administrations can decide to take different positions in litigation. And so rules that the Obama Justice Department was defending as being consistent with the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, this administration is now saying, no, we don't believe that's true anymore, and we're going to be relooking at those rules. So, court, we're going to please don't rule on this. Of course, administrations use appointments to reflect and to effectuate their policy preferences. So we've seen appointments in this administration that reflect a very, very different approach to regulation and to energy and pollution issues. But there are a bunch of different things that administrations can decide to reorganize an agency that not only has whatever substantive effect it would have in terms of eliminating or adding different substantive areas, but is also very disruptive to the agency workforce. And so they're focused on reorganizing rather than doing their substantive work. So let me talk about the Obama administration and climate. Work on climate issues started in the first term, especially after legislation, the Waxman-Markey bill that would have been a legislative approach to climate change was not successful in getting a positive vote in the Senate, and therefore failed. So President Obama started looking towards executive actions that he could take. And if you ever heard him talk about climate change, you could tell that he felt about it very, very personally, and that for him to be in this powerful position and not do as much as he could to try to address climate change would be a personal failing and disappointment on his part. So he really moved into this in a big way at the beginning of the second term when he issued his climate action plan, which had three goals you can see here. One is reduce our own carbon emissions here in the US. Think about adaptation, so recognizing that some amount of climate change will happen no matter what we do. And then the third pillar was the recognition that this is indeed a global issue, and that the United States ought to be a leader in working with other countries to help them reduce their emissions and prepare for climate change as well. And that in order to be an effective and credible international leader, we need to be taking steps at home. What he did was really a very masterful management approach. He encouraged any agency across the federal government to come forward with activities in these areas that they could do. And if you've ever worked in an organization for a leader, it's pretty great to be working on issues that are a top priority for your executive, because you get a lot of positive intention and encouragement. If you have problems, you can get them resolved. And so everybody wanted to be doing something in this space. So it wasn't just EPA and the Department of Energy and the Department of the Interior, but it was also Housing and Urban Development, who could require that homes that got subsidized through federal housing programs had to be energy efficient, for example. And so many agencies, even ones you might not think of, had opportunities to make a difference in these three areas. At EPA, where I was in the Office of Air and Radiation, these are probably the most impactful regulations that we put out. Basically, if you look at greenhouse gases in this country as a pie, about a third of the pie comes from motor vehicles, cars and trucks. About a third of it comes from power generation, and about a third of it comes from everything else. And so under Administrator Lisa Jackson and then Gina McCarthy, we focused on the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So clean cars, 2 rules were passed that would significantly increase the fuel efficiency of motor vehicles. Same thing with trucks. The biggest stationary source or industrial source of greenhouse gases was fossil power generation. And so we developed the Clean Power Plan in 2015. Interestingly, the next 2 biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions on the stationary source side are oil and gas development, which you see in the bottom left, the main emission there being methane, which is actually a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. And then the next one, you wouldn't necessarily think this, is landfills, which generate methane as the waste decays. And indeed, they continue to generate methane even after they are no longer taking waste. So they are very challenging to regulate. Also, many of them are public facilities, so that makes an additional challenge. So we put all of these out there using very extensive public processes, lots of input. We got 4.3 million comments on the Clean Power Plan before we were done. Everybody had a chance to weigh in, and I'll say this about these rules, but it's true about every regulatory program I've ever worked on. The system we have in this country of requiring agencies to put proposals out, take comment, and then respond to those comments, in my view, is extremely worthwhile. I don't think I've worked on a single rule, either at the state or federal level, that didn't improve as a result of comments we got on the proposal. Because EPA is not all-knowing. There are people who work in these industries, motor vehicles, oil and gas, energy generation, whatever it is. This is their world. They're the experts. And so while we have people at EPA who are very expert on these industries, they don't know everything. And so that public comment process is really important. In addition, during the second term, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement happened at the end of 2015, and there was also an amendment to that Montreal Protocol that I mentioned before that focused on new chemicals that were invented in order to preserve the ozone layer, but have turned out to be harmful in climate change. So folks got together and worked on that too. So now we have a new administration. We're all very familiar with the changes in administrations here in the United States. That's what our democracy is about, and it is really strong and robust, and can manage these changes, have been able to manage these changes. President Trump, when he came in, immediately issued a couple of very significant, from the climate world, executive orders. One was an order that said, we're not going to have as many regulations in this country. So if any agency wants to do a new regulation, they're going to have to eliminate 2. That is, by some description, a pretty arbitrary rule, but he's the president. He gets to say that if he wants to have a goal of having fewer rules, and then the agencies have to go out and figure out how to implement that. On a substantive level, he issued an executive order about energy. He directed the agencies to take regulatory barriers, perceived barriers out of the way of energy development, in particular fossil energy development, specifically noting the Clean Power Plan. And so the agencies started doing those things pretty promptly. And as of this point in the administration, these things that you see here, all of these key rules or programs are either on hold or the administration is actively working to reconsider or repeal them. Clean Power Plan, I'll talk about more in a minute. So, you know, from the perspective of someone who believes that these rules were necessary and appropriate and reasonable, and that it is really important in this country that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, of course, this is very troubling. These are but 6 examples of regulatory changes that this administration is pursuing, and that would be subject for another day if you were interested in other things that are going on. Let me talk about the Clean Power Plan for just a minute. It kind of all started with a decision by the US Supreme Court in a case called Massachusetts versus EPA, where the court said that EPA had to make a decision about whether greenhouse gases from motor vehicles endangered public health and welfare. That's a legal obligation it found that EPA had under the Clean Air Act. So that decision was made in 2007. So when the Obama administration came in, it was faced with responding to this decision. And in 2009, EPA did make a decision on that petition, and it found that greenhouse gases from motor vehicles did endanger public health and welfare. That finding triggered a number of regulatory actions, including the Clean Car rules that I mentioned a minute ago, and the Clean Power Plan, which is a technology-based rule. It comes out of a section of the Clean Air Act where EPA is supposed to set technology-based emission standards for a whole range of different industry types. And there is a rule that applies to coal-fired power plants, gas-fired power plants. It has a part for existing facilities, and it has a part for EPA to set standards for new facilities, ones that would be built in the future. So the Clean Power Plan, this is kind of complicated, but the Clean Power Plan, under that rule, what we did was we looked at the types of approaches that fossil energy producers were already using across the country that had the result of reducing CO2 emissions from energy generation. We recognized that power generation is not like every other industry where you have independent plants operating in an unconnected way. So for example, steel mills across the country, they're their own thing, right? Or cement plants or chemical plants. But utilities, energy generation is all connected through this incredible grid of wires and managed as a network. So we were seeing that utility companies who managed a number of different individual plants would make decisions on a fleet-wide basis, and whether it was greenhouse gases or other pollutants, or just managing their business, because they understood that all the power fed into the grid, and so they could manage on a fleet-wide basis. So that's how we developed the Clean Power Plan. It predicted that by 2030, it would reduce CO2 emissions from those facilities by 32% below the levels they were in 2005. That was our prediction, of course, right? These rules are always based on predictions of emission reductions, predictions of cost, predictions of health protection. It was extremely controversial. I told you we got 4.3 million comments on it. Not all of them were complimentary. Indeed, many were not. The utility industry itself was split. People focus on how these things will affect them, depending on the type of industry they have and where they're located. So it was very challenging. We got challenged in court. The rule was actually put on delay by the U.S. Supreme Court, which was both disappointing and surprising. But the new administration has now proposed to just repeal the Clean Power Plan and replace it with something called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which will focus on only one of the approaches that we included in our rule. That is the kinds of efficiency improvements that power plants can make within the fence line of each individual plant. So that rule went out for public comment. The public comment period has closed, and so EPA is working through all that material, and we don't know exactly when they will finalize the rule, but my guess is that they will try to finalize it this year so that when it inevitably is challenged in court, at least some of the litigation will, they'll have time to work on it before the next election. I wanted to mention a couple of other issues of concern. You may have questions about this pretty quickly, and then I want to finish with maybe a little bit of positive material. Things that are concerning those of us that are paying close attention to what's going on in EPA is the apparent change in the role of science at the agency and in agency decision-making. The Office of Research and Development at EPA, which was the largest office when I was there, has really taken a beating in terms of staff. And EPA has also changed the representation on many of its external peer review committees in ways that are very concerning to the scientific community. This is essential to the integrity of EPA's policymaking. If the science is not credible, then the policy will not be credible. Very concerning. Recently, EPA has put out a proposal that would suggest that EPA should only consider a narrow range of public health benefits in its rulemaking. I'm happy to talk about that more if you have questions about it, but this is extremely concerning. It is, in the view of many, a way of putting the finger on the scale so that public health benefits, which have been significant based on scientific research, would not be as would be diminished so that costs would outweigh them. EPA is making a lot of changes to a lot of things in the air program. A lot of that is happening through policy documents or other approaches that do not afford public input or transparency. That's concerning. And you've probably been reading things about whether EPA is vigorously enforcing the law. This is a common shift from one type of administration to another, but I think we are seeing less enforcement. Okay, I see there are questions coming in, so I'm going to zoom along here. A couple of things to just think about. So despite the fact that EPA is has a very different view in the administration to fossil generation, you look at these charts from the U.S. Energy Information Agency that show how coal is just being used less, and it's because it's not because of EPA's regulations, or not entirely because, it's because coal is becoming more and more expensive, especially relative to other types of energy generation. And solar and wind in particular have gotten way cheaper. You actually can see on this chart a little uptick since 2016. So perhaps that does reflect a little bump up in response to the changes in policy. I'm from Indiana. I got to brag on Indiana a little bit. Here's an example of some good things that are happening in a state where you might not think these things would happen. We have something called the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, which is a series of chapters headed up by Purdue University, but including people from all universities all across Indiana, giving us real information about the expected impacts of climate change on a whole range of issues that are really important to Hoosiers. I think these are terrific. Each one has a 4 to 6 page executive summary that is very accessible to a lay audience, has good charts and graphs in it and stuff. So if you Google Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, it'll come right back up. Indiana University 2 years ago launched something called the Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge. This is a significant effort that I have been fortunate to be involved with, where we have scientists and researchers and social scientists, economists, et cetera, all across the agency working on accurate predictions of climate change in Indiana, feasible solutions, and effective communication around the state. So these are really good and positive things happening in my state. In addition, I spend a lot of time with local governments, and that's really where things are happening, right? Because it's mayors that have to make these decisions day by day. What pavement am I going to use? Should I do solar energy? Am I going to buy electric vehicles? And they need information and help so that they're not wasting, they're not reinventing wheels that have already been invented. In addition, even in Indiana, we have businesses that are just really on the forefront. Cummins Engine is one of the favorite ones I want to talk about. Always nothing is associated with diesel engines more than Cummins, but they are now building electric drivetrains for heavy duty applications. We have Aardvark Paper Straw Company in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Who knew? They held or hold, maybe still, the only FDA approval for a paper straw. So when the no plastic straw thing happened, all of a sudden they got a lot more orders and they've been hiring a lot of people. We have extensive wind energy coming into Indiana, and this building on the top left is something called the Battery Innovation Center, which is like a little mini national energy lab stuck down in southern Indiana, where they work with companies huge and tiny across the world on battery storage, battery recycling, all kinds of battery innovations. So and this is just Indiana, right? And it's just 4 things from Indiana. So there are these great things going on all across the country. I like to end my talks with making sure people know that there are things that they can do. I expect that you know all these things already, so I'm not going to go through them, but please do stay involved. So with that, I will finish and I'll stop sharing my screen. And we can see what questions people have.
Thank you, Janet. That was fabulous. And we do have some questions. The first question is, public health has always been a basis for environmental rules. What limitations is the current administration placing on the types of public health it will consider?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, the environmental statutes, at least the ones I'm familiar with, are all based on public health. That's what they are for. I have noticed, and I would suggest that if you ever are super bored and want to read something in the Federal Register, if you read one of these EPA rule proposals, you may not see the words public health mentioned very often. I am noticing that. And when I was at EPA, we were talking about public health all the time because that's what motivated them. I would say the thing that is most, well, let me figure out how to answer that. This administration has clearly said that they do not believe climate change is a priority. And they have identified clean water. They have identified lead in children. And they've identified cleaning up hazardous waste sites. These are priorities that I've seen. Whether there are effective strategies that actually address those issues, I think people are really questioning whether they are doing meaningful things. But they've said that. One thing I want to mention is the thing I alluded to before, which is for years, for decades, under Republican and Democratic administrations, when EPA has evaluated the public health benefits associated with the rule, they have counted all the full range of public health benefits. So let me give you an example. We had to do a rule on power plants and mercury emissions under the EPA toxics program. When you reduce mercury from a power plant, you also reduce other important air pollutants like sulfur dioxide and particulate matter. So in considering the public health benefits from that rule, we counted all of those public health benefits. It's like if you quit smoking in order primarily to reduce your chance of getting lung cancer, you will also have a full range of other health benefits that come along for the ride. And in addition, you will be protecting people in your family from secondhand smoke exposure. So the view has always been, you look at all of those benefits and compare that to the cost, right? This administration has proposed to say, no, EPA can only consider the public health benefits associated with the specific pollutant being regulated. So if that's only mercury, then there's a lot less public health benefits that would be counted. They will still happen as a result of that rule. This is one of the biggest things that people are now concerned about because it would apply that if they get it through on this rule, they could use it in any EPA rule, and other federal agencies could also use it.
Great, thank you. Another question is, once a law is passed, like the Clean Power Plan, and regulations are issued, how easy or complicated is it to roll that back? And do they have to have another rulemaking process to undo a rule?
That is a super good question. And the answer is yes, they do. Unless Congress, so all of the things I talked about were regulations that were done by the executive branch, by EPA. Congress could come in quickly and pass a law, and that could override a regulation. But but they haven't. So EPA has to go through a rulemaking just like we did. Now, here's something interesting, however. Our rulemakings took several years. They had huge dockets with all kinds of information in them. The approach that this administration is taking is not a factual one. They're not saying EPA got the facts wrong. They're saying EPA interpreted the law incorrectly. And so they still need to go through a rulemaking and put their reasoning out for public comment. But because they're using legal reasoning, they will avoid being criticized for having wrong facts. So the bottom line is, yes, they have to do everything that we did. And if they skip steps, those rules will be legally vulnerable. And in the first year or so, we saw Administrator Pruitt skipping a lot of steps because he wanted to do things fast. And people challenged those rules and they were overturned. So we will have however many of these rules they've proposed. They will finalize as many as they can. They will all be challenged. My prediction is that they will not all be resolved by the end of this 4-year term. Great question.
Thank you. So here's another question. I rely on the Union of Concerned Scientists for information about the EPA and the need for public comment on proposed changes in regs and policy. How does that compare with other organizations that also seek to guide the public?
I have incredible admiration for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I commend you for using that as a source. In Indiana, we now have something called Concerned Scientists at Indiana University, which is like a local state-based offshoot of Union of Concerned Scientists, and I don't know whether other states have that too. There are a couple of other sites that I'll mention to you that are not as hard science, but are much more policy-oriented. There are 2 groups that have emerged since this election that are staffed by former EPA, mostly career staff, retired people, and some political appointees like myself. One is called the Environmental Protection Network. If you Google that, it'll come up. They comment on a variety of rules and other policies. And then there's another one called Save the EPA Alums. And I have to say that specifically because there's another group called Save the EPA, which has been around for a while. Save the EPA Alums. And then the niche that they have carved out, it's very specific. It's all about what proposals are out for public comment. And then there'll be a little explanation in plain English of what the proposal is and some ideas or suggestions about things that people might want to think about as they're formulating their comments, as well as directions about when and how to do it and all that sort of thing. Save the EPA Alums is great for that. The Environmental Protection Network is intended to provide a place for anybody, but especially members of Congress or their staff or people in the media to go to try to get a pretty objective view on things that are going on, or things like when a budget is proposed. Oh my gosh, is that complicated? I spent 8 years at the Obama administration trying not to learn about how the budget is formulated because it is so complicated. So when the administration puts this out there, how do people possibly understand what's actually in there? One way is people at the Environmental Protection Network who used to be budget people at EPA and understand that process, put information out about it. So that was a long answer to your question, but yay on Union of Concerned Scientists, and there are a couple of other great organizations.
Thank you. We have, I think, time for maybe one more question. We're kind of running out of time. Over the last few years, climate change, global temperature, greenhouse gas reinforcing has been accelerating. What is known about these worrisome changes?
Well, so there are many studies out there. EPA has put out in the past something called the Climate Change Indicators Report, which I think is a really great, they're not doing it now, but we did one or two when I was at EPA with different chapters about how climate change is impacting life in the United States. And here's a little tip for you. This is pretty interesting. If you remember, when the new administration came in, there was a lot of concern that historical information and scientific information would be taken off the EPA website and disappear and would no longer be accessible to the public. There was a huge outcry about this. And so here's what EPA did. EPA took a snapshot of the EPA website on January 16th, 2017, the last day of the Obama administration. And if you go onto the EPA website, there's a little banner across the top that says, if you want to see prior information, you can see it here. And those pages are no longer curated and they're not being updated, but you can go on there and you can see the last speech that Gina McCarthy gave and the last press release that the McCarthy administration did. But you can also find a lot of climate related information, including that indicators report. So the key concerns about climate change are warming temperatures and all the issues that come along with that, disease, more air pollution, agricultural impacts, and that sort of thing, drought, too much water at certain times of the year when we have enough, and not enough water at times of year where we need some more, increased storms and flooding and erosion on the coasts, wildfires, and all the impacts that these things have on our infrastructure, on our agriculture, on our natural, our forests, on ecosystems, and on our health and way of life. So there's lots of information out there about that, and maybe I'll just tell you one other little anecdote to illustrate. We're all in some sense climate observers. And scientists, anybody that grows tomatoes knows how much water they need to give them when they bloom and all that sort of thing. I was on the phone with a woman up in Alaska And we were talking away, and she stopped, and she made kind of a loud noise, and she said, "I can't believe it. There's a hummingbird outside my window. We do not have hummingbirds in Alaska." So look around. We love this country. We want it to be safe and healthy for our children, grandchildren, and on into the future. There have been people who have said, well, the climate goes up, the climate goes down. There is no perfect climate. And as Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist from Texas Tech University, says, well, there is a perfect climate for us, right? There was a perfect climate for dinosaurs. Now there's a perfect climate for us. So we have many challenges ahead. We continue on this path. I want to thank you so much for your interest. And Jerry, if you want to send me the questions we didn't get to, I'll be happy to type out some answers and send them along. I just have enjoyed this so much, even though I've been doing all the talking.
Great, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I am sure we could go on all night,
Yeah.
But we won't. But I'd like to thank you for your time and graciously be willing to present to us. And we will be sending out the recording of this with some of the links and hopefully your slides, if that's okay with you. And that people will be able to, dig in and look some more at them. We can send you some of the questions that weren't answered. And just in closing, I'd just like to remind people that April is Earth Day, is celebrated in April. You are all old enough to remember 1970 was the first Earth Day. This is the 49th anniversary of Earth Day. I'm hoping by the 50th, we will have made some significant improvement for our grandchildren. So this Earth Day, honor your grandchildren by making a donation to Elders Climate Action. Help us get this rolling, help us make a greater impact. We're here not for us, we're here for our grandchildren and future generations. And that's what we're about. So I'd like to thank you very much. Thank you, Steve, for your great introduction, and Jen for managing the call. I'd like to thank you all for being on the call tonight. And we'll see you next month in April on the 23rd. We have an exciting new project that we're embarking on called Elders Promote the Vote. It's a collaboration with the Environmental Voter Project. And we need to get environmentalists out to vote. And so given that, we're going to close the meeting, and I'd like to thank you. We're getting lots of thank yous and great presentation in the chat box and in the Q&A. So thank you so much, Janet. I hope we can meet again, and I hope next time you can come and tell us we're on the way down from 1.5 degrees, and it's not going to be there. So thank you all, and good night.
Good night.
Hey, Janet, I got a quick question.
Yeah.
How long do you think it'll take the EPA to recover in 2021 if indeed there's administration change?
I think they'll turn pretty fast.
Good.
They got to have the ability to bring some people in,
Yeah.
But with the right leadership,
Mm-hmm.
Those career people, they're smart.
Yeah.
They've got stuff in the bottom drawer that'll be ready to go.
I remember when Ann Gorsuch, Neil Gorsuch's mother,
Yep.
and Rita Lavelle were removed and Ruckelshaus came back.
Yeah.
How quickly the EPA turned around.
We need
It
another.
really did.
We need.
I was working with
Ruckelshaus again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
It was you were so gracious to accept our invitation.
Yes.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you so much.
Yeah.
And I hope to see you again soon. I'll be at the sustainability conference.
Oh, me too. Me too.
Yeah,
I'll see you there.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye, and thanks so much.
Goodbye. Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Night.